We are going to energise the country.
We need to wake up and smell the coffee.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Another future's possible, but we've got to fight for it.
Order!
Hello and welcome to the Debated podcast. As always, I'm your host, Will. And in this episode, I'm delighted to be joined by Dana Mills, who is an academic and author of a new book that's just come out on Rosa Luxemburg. So welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. Delighted to be here.
So the first question that I'd like to ask you is, for those who aren't aware of who Rosa was, could you just give a quick explanation as to who she was and her role in politics?
So Rosa Luxemburg was a Polish Jewish activist, writer, thinker, who started working at the end of the 19th century and really saw the change of the century in. She was named by some of her comrades as the best brain after Marx, and she was one of the most important interpreters of Marx, and especially an important advocate of democracy and the Marxist tradition. She was a democratic socialist. She was a revolutionary who lived through at least 3 revolutions, which is the 2 Russians and the German, but more revolutionary events around the world. She was a prolific writer, an agitator, and she really was, I think, a woman who fought for freedom through revolution for all. She was one of the most important advocates of really socialism from below. Most of her work was done in Germany, where she came after, she pursued a PhD in Zurich, and then she moved to Germany as a young woman. And she did most of her work there, and also in the Second Internationale, which was then the big socialist organization that brought together the greatest minds of her time. And she found an untimely death at the age of 47, murdered by the Freikorps, who were proto-fascist militias that went on to be active under Hitler. So her death, for many, including myself, signifies really the transition from a Germany that had hopes for democracy to a Germany that moved into a very dark age.
And of course, you mentioned that Rosa was from Poland. And I think one of the things that you very much touch upon in the book is her involvement in politics in Poland from a very young age. To what extent do you think that the change in Poland, which at in the 17th century was quite a much more democratic country than, for example, Britain was. Now it's much more of an authoritarian country. Do you think that change was particularly prevalent during Rosa's upbringing, or do you think that it was more of a long-term change on that road to a more authoritarian Poland?
So we must remember that in Rosa's time, she was a subject of the Russian Empire. Poland was governed by Russia. And in her time, as in before it, so both Marx and Engels and Marx's daughter, Eleanor Marx, really important book that helped sort of the background for my own and a lot of my thinking right now is Rachel Holmes's biography of Eleanor Marx. All the 3 Marxes and Engels advocate for Polish nationalism, as they thought that an independent Poland would be the bulwark against Russia and would kind of be the beginning of the demise of the Russian Empire. Rosa Luxemburg, from a very young age, dissented against that view and saw Polish nationalism as a distraction, as something that would only benefit the gentry, the Polish bourgeoisie, and advocated internationalism over nationalism. And she was a very persistent critic of the view that nationalism would be a way to bring down empires. And at some point when this was already commonplace held view, and it was clear that Poland was to become independent and other countries as well, she was still holding on to her view, which is interesting. I think it's very hard to draw a direct line from the period in which she lived and before it. She studied Poland from early centuries and beginning of industrialization, actually. That was her PhD thesis, until where we are now, because the one thing she didn't live through is fascism in the mid-20th century. And one thing that she really accentuates in her writing is the unpredictability of history and the fact that we can't foresee what will happen when history takes very dramatic turns, which is an interesting feature for a writer in the Marxist tradition, because obviously we think of Marx, we think of determinism, we think of historical materialism. But she actually understood that when you put in human agency in part of this framework, you can't really predict where things would go. And I mean, when we think about Poland right now, it is so different to her Polish upbringing. And I have a lot of people in my circles who are Polish immigrants, both in the UK, in other parts of Europe, and of course in Israel, which is where I'm from. And, I was raised amongst many Polish Jews, including, I should say, Rosa's great nephew is a very close friend of my aunt's. So, this is a background from which I myself came. And it is a very different background to the one in which she was raised. And I think, that everyone wants to draw parallels between where we are now and what happened in the beginning of the 20th century, and especially the middle of the 20th century. But I actually think we need to be very careful with that, not least because we know what happened in the 20th century, right? If Rosa was alive today, she would be writing one pamphlet after the other, studying what's going on and comparing it and not saying, oh, it's exactly the same. So I think we're living in a very different time. We're living with very different technologies, but the danger of authoritarianism is the same, but its guises are very, very different.
Now, of course, as you mentioned Rosa went to Germany and, of course, was involved very much in the political scene in Germany. And at one point, of course, she was a member of the SDP before she left. Do you think that the political situation in Germany at the time was more open to perhaps more left-wing politics and perhaps more Marxist-leaning politics than perhaps Germany is today?
The short answer is no, because first of all, it should be noted that the SPD, the party in which she agitated most of her life, was illegal about 30 years before she joined it. So August Bebel, who was again a close comrade of Marx and wrote alongside him, as well as Liebknecht, the elder. So Karl Liebknecht was a close comrade of Rosa's, and Wilhelm Liebknecht was one of the founders of the SPD. Both of them had to work in hiding for some periods because the SPD and left-wing agitation was illegal. By the time Rosa joins the SPD, it's already a fairly centrist party, a social democratic party. And I should say that social democracy at that time was not what we understand today as social democracy, not least women and the working classes did not have the vote. So who benefits from the social democracy is a very big question. And throughout her life, from the moment she enters the movement, through Polish anti-nationalism, then the Internationale, and then the SPD, Rosa is always the left-wing marker. She is always the Marxist dissenter, really. She's never in the mainstream, and she never wants to be in the mainstream. I mean, I don't think at any point of her life she thought, tomorrow I'll wake up and I'm going to lead a party. And, one of the people she has a long-standing correspondence and a debate with is Lenin, who was a leader of the left-wing party. And there are a lot of both similarities between them, but also differences. And I mean, when we think about Germany today, again, it's a country that has been through such a huge arc of history since her time. And, I think it is a social democracy in a different way to Rosa's, but it is really a social democracy in a way that neither the UK nor the US are. And, it has a lot of flaws. I'm not going to defend Germany now, and especially not in context of European politics, but it definitely is protecting its citizens much more than many countries are doing at the moment. And actually, a lot of the things that Germany is doing at the moment are things that Rosa agitated for, be it, a more expansive social state, really, be it the refugee, allowing more refugees in. Like, let us forget that Merkel was the leader who allowed more refugees than most other European leaders. And let us forget that Rosa herself was a political refugee. So, there are some interesting parallels there. But again, I think, Germany that comes out of the Second World War, that goes through the whole period of having the GDR and the wall and the separation and then the fall of the USSR, is a very different nation and has a very different consciousness. The more interesting question to me would be what kind of home would Rosa find in today's Germany? And I mean, I went to Berlin for the 100th year marking of her murder. And, there were huge state affairs. I spoke in a huge event in the center of Berlin where the Berlin mayor spoke. And there was a massive march throughout the streets of Berlin. So it's really interesting that she was so extreme in her life and her afterlife, and she's still loved and revered in contemporary Germany, which kind of, I thought, that's something for us to think about. I don't know if we're going to see, the Sylvia Pankhurst 100 years to her death, if there's going to be, 20,000 people walking through the streets of London. I really hope so, but I'm not holding my breath for that. So, very, very different country.
One of the things that I think is particularly interesting in the way that you describe and discuss it in the book is Rosa's relationship with Karl Klee. And I wondered, what do you think that relationship represented in terms of politics, in terms of, because of course they had quite different ideas. What do you think it represents in terms of the different trends of thoughts in left-wing and Marxist politics?
So Karl Klee was an interesting figure. He was very central to the SPD, as was also Edward Bernstein, who another person she argued with quite a lot in her lifetime, and many others, of course. But I think these two represent something very different to her. I think Karl Klee represents a certain reading of Marxism that lets go of dialectics, of more, I would say, a moderate reading of Marx that allows for expansiveness into a centrist party. One of the main things that Rosa Luxemburg outlines early in her life, I should say very, very early, we're talking about not even the 1910s, a little bit before that, is the connection between imperialism and capitalism, and how the SPD is complacent in imperialism. And at that point, Germany is, conducting a colonial regime in many parts of the world. And she is a teacher in the SPD school, and she lectures in a series of lectures about the effects of capitalism penetrating non-capitalist economies. Later, this becomes her great work. I think one of her greatest works, really, the accumulation of capital. And this is a point in which Kautsky and Bernstein and others, who are not critical of imperialism, who are not critical of this expansionism of capitalism, kind of go away from her strand of thinking. And this is even more pronounced when she connects that critique of imperialism to her critique of the First World War, where, again, most of the SPD at that point voted for war credits, wanted Germany to join the war, were very militaristic. Rosa Luxemburg was all her life at the center against war, at the center against violence. She went to Russia during the first revolution, the 1905 revolution, and she chronicled what violence does to the people on the ground, what it means to live when the state enacts violence on its people. So for her, Germany joining an imperialist war was really a moment of no return. So I think, there's a lot of things to be learned there about what it is that left socialist parties, or left socialist by name, accept as part of them. And for Luxemburg, it was always socialism is dissenting against militarism, is dissenting against imperialism, whereas for Kautsky and others, it was part and parcel, and you needed to do what you needed to do in order to keep the party in power and to enable its rule. And I would say, just as a conclusion, that one of the most interesting things for me, and something that I'm still writing about, was actually the relationship between Rosa Luxemburg and Louise Kautsky, who was Karl Kautzy's second wife. His first wife went to England and lived with Engels in his last years. And Rosa Luxemburg was a very close friend of Louise Kautsky. And throughout the years of dissenting, she writes these awful pamphlets against Karl, in which she kind of takes down every single thing he writes. But then at the same time, she's writing very loving and tender letters to his wife. And there's kind of this ability to live with contradiction and with dissent that I think is really very urgent for us right now. And kind of the ability to say, I disagree vehemently with this man, but I can still be his wife's best friend, which I think is really a remarkable feature. And just to end on the fact that Louise Kautsky in herself was an important activist, and a socialist feminist who has been, like many others, written out of history. And I'm writing about her right now because these women really sustained the movement, and not many people are interested in them, interested in the gentleman, as always.
One thing I think you really bring out in the book is the mixture between philosophy and politics that is all wrapped together. And you see that in Rosa's work, whether it be Accumulations of Capital or any of her other works. Do you think that the relationship between philosophical thought and political thought isn't as emphasized now in modern politics, and that we don't tend to think of politics now as connected to philosophy as it was in Rosa's time?
I mean, she wasn't a philosopher. She was an economist, and she was a political theorist. And there's one legacy. She takes a lot of things from Marx in form and in content. And there's a very famous Marxist quote, "Philosophers hitherto interpreted the world, the goal is to change it." And she definitely lived that dictum. I think we do have our Marxist thinkers. We do have, great figures on the left. We've just lost a couple. We've lost Mark Fisher a couple of years ago. We've lost David Graeber just recently. But we also have really important women thinkers of our time. I have to say, a really important inspiration for me was Jodie Dean. She's still around and writing, thankfully. And, she's a great thinker on the left. She's a great activist. And, I went on a march with her once, and we had a chat about Luxemburg and Lenin. And that I kind of, that stuck with me as kind of thinking there are still people who are writing books as well as going on marches and doing all of these things at the same time. And I mean, the other thing is that we usually notify these signifiers after they're gone, which is very sad. And Luxemburg she had a cult around her in her lifetime, but the way that we understand her today is 10 million times larger than how she was understood in her lifetime. So, one thing that we really need to do better is to identify these radical women thinkers in our time and not wait, 100 years later, so someone will write a book and think about these relationships. I really do think we have quite extraordinary women thinkers, agitators. I'm a really big fan of the work of Priya Gopal, who just published Insurgent Empire and does a lot of work on the ground as well, a lot of organizing. As I said, Jodie Dean. So, there's a lot of names out there, but we just need to be more attentive to their work in the present and not wait for the departure.
Now, just turning away from the book for a moment, I know that relatively recently you were involved in protests in Israel against Benjamin Netanyahu. Could you explain what the protests were about for people who aren't aware of them, and what the experience was like?
So I should say in parenthesis that I'm half Israeli, half Welsh, and I was raised in Israel, and I was raised really on the left. I mean, we read Luxemburg when I was 13, 14. We were talking about her in the movement. As an anti-nationalist Jewish woman, she was really important for us to read and to engage these days. And Benjamin Netanyahu has been prime minister for very many years, at least a decade in succession, but more years beyond that, and has really created a country that has drawn away from democracy a long time ago, and has really got into fascistic lines of government, whether it is just yesterday, the Knesset, the parliament of Israel, basically held one vote around an issue to do with him, and then the coalition didn't like it, and then they recalled the vote, which is, of course, a clearly anti-democratic mechanism. There's been huge attacks on freedom of speech. There's been huge attacks on civil society. There's been huge attacks on human rights organizations that have been ongoing for as long as I can remember myself, but have been really intensified, and especially with the rise of social media, which enables to find victims and to kind of halt them very easily. And Netanyahu himself has been involved in several corruption affairs that have been brought to public knowledge quite a while ago. And no police or legal repercussions have followed that. So, although it is clear that he was involved in wrongdoing and in corruption, he is facing no responsibility. At the same time, you have what's happening everywhere, which is the COVID crisis that has hit Israel-Palestine. We should actually say Israel-Palestine here because it is, the fate is very bound together very badly. And you have a whole country that has been forced to go into lockdown without any economic safeguards, while seeing its ruler really enjoying a life of joy and indulgence and high-powered travel, etc. And that has really pushed towards popular protest that has started really early on. We're talking about February, March, the beginning of lockdown. People went for socially distant protests. So people stood 2 meters apart, all wearing masks, holding signs against Netanyahu, and has been ongoing till this stage. And I should say, for those of us on the left in Israel that see Palestinian sovereignty as key for any process of democracy in Israel, and this is where it's a frustrating conversation because you can't just talk about anti-corruption or, holding Netanyahu to accountability. You have to talk about ending the occupation of Palestine. You have to talk about ensuring freedom and human rights for all. For many of us on that strand, we're trying to really think about where this agenda fits in these kind of very widespread pro-democracy protests, that some of which do not come from the left. And just so you get a sense of numbers, we're talking about one last weekend, there was a protest of around 210,000 people, while the whole population of Israel is around 7 million. So you're talking about a very large percentage of people who just went to the streets with homemade signs. And I mean, I'm an activist before I'm a writer and before I'm doing anything else. That's kind of how I think, and that's where my heart lies. And for me, it's been beyond exhilarating to see this kind of huge popular uprising and to see the fact that people are really talking about caring for their country and caring for their community. However, as a good lefty, I really want to see the agenda pushed further. And I really want all my comrades, everyone who I've been working with since I'm a teenager, how to end the occupation really, we're trying to push the agenda to be more radical really, and to talk not just about getting rid of Netanyahu, but what would happen the following day. And the most important thing for us is to really talk about what happens with the occupation, because it is a dream to see a leader that is not Netanyahu, but it is a very small dream compared to a dream of a democratic Israel-Palestine with equal human rights for all. So, this is an ongoing event. There's at least 2 or 3 protests every week. And I do encourage your listeners to look up on the media and to see what's going on, because it's not being reported in the UK at all. I'm really grateful that you asked me about it. But this is the beginning of something that I sense would be quite interesting and quite important.
We're coming towards the end of the podcast. It's been great to speak to you, Dane. And I've got one final question. Just turning back to Rosa for a moment. Of course, last year it was the 100th anniversary of her death. If Rosa could have somehow been transported to today, what do you think she would think of the world today? Do you think that she would be happy about some improvements, or do you think that she would still think that there is a long way to go?
I mean, both things at the same time. She was a dialectician, and by that, it means that she really knew how to live with oppositions. And I think we mustn't underestimate a lot of the achievements of her work and others like her. Eleanor Marx, Sylvia Pankhurst, who I mentioned, which is, the 8-hour day, it is universal suffrage. But, over the past few days, we've been watching how in the UK, the parliament is voting down the ability to feed children over the holidays. And you're seeing huge surges of poverty around the world. And I'm talking now about the so-called West, the so-called developed countries. I'm not talking about, the countries that she then wrote about as part of the imperialist project. And she would be hugely frustrated by the fact that we're still allowing these things to get under the radar, to actually go unchecked. And she would absolutely advocate for protest, for revolution. She was first and foremost a revolutionary. She was first and foremost someone who called for a radical overhaul of today. But she would also sort of notice the things that we have attained and we really need to fight for. And, I'm now reading the new biography of Sylvia Pankhurst by Rachel Holmes, and you read about Victorian poverty, and then you look at the news and you see all these clips of children being hungry, and you think, we really haven't learned enough. And I think that's another lesson that you can transpose. It's exactly the same lesson. And of course, they work together. They were friends. Where do we stand when we see people around us going hungry? Where do we stand when we see people being persecuted for their opinions? She was a very strong defender of freedom of speech. She was a very strong defender of freedom to dissent. We are seeing a huge curtailing of civil rights and human rights again, I'm talking about Europe, I'm talking about the UK, I'm talking about the US, I'm not talking about anywhere beyond our very immediate world. And I think we really need to insist on these things that she fought for and many others have fought for, and not let ourselves kind of be washed away with other things that might be taking our attention right now. And there was one sentence I found from her that I took as the epigraph for the book, which is, history will do its work, see that you too do your work. And I think that's basically the calling, that we need to really every day do the work, go campaign, organize in whatever way we can, but also know that there's an arc that is much larger than us that is taking place.
That's a sentiment I completely agree with, and I'm sure most of the listeners will agree with as well. Thank you again for coming on the podcast. If people want to find out more about yourself and about the book, where should they go to find out more?
My biography of Rosa Luxemburg is freely available on Reaction books and from all good booksellers. Buy from independent booksellers, don't buy from Amazon, who are treating their laborers in the same way that capitalism treated workers in Rosa's time. And I tweet at Dana Naomi Mills, and I write quite a lot of opinion pieces. And I think, Google in that sense could be your friend, and you can easily find my work online also.
Excellent. Thank you once again for coming on the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. If you've enjoyed it, you can subscribe to us on iTunes, Spotify, Podbeam, and Amazon Music. You can also follow us on Twitter, @DebatedPodcast, like us on Facebook, Debated Podcast, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, whether about appearing on an episode of the podcast or commenting on an episode that you've listened to, you can do so at thedebatedpodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. I hope you listen to the next one.